Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. The violence in Iraq lends emphasis to this central fact. The country is facing the worst sectarian strife in its history. The conflict embroiling ethnic, tribal, and sectarian groups suggests that Iraq's fragile sense of national identity is fast unraveling. The cost of this dissension can be extraordinary, a descent from the uncertainties of an identity crisis into the hopeless mire of a failed state. Saving Iraq from this fate will require an enormous effort on the part of Iraquis and others. My guest is Phebe Marr, a leading American specialist on Iraq and Southwest Asia. Phebe Marr, welcome to Dialogue.
Very pleasure to be here.
It's an honor to have you here, Phebe, and a pleasure as well, I must say.
Well, I'm a great fan of the Wilson Center, as you know.
And I'm a great fan of Phebe Marr. And very interested in this question, Phebe. On one level, it strikes me that it can be very succinctly, directly posed. That is, how do Iraqis define themselves and their sense of nationhood? But it also strikes me that at a more fundamental level, it may be extremely complex because of the actors. I mean, ethnically, you've got Kurds and Arabs. Religiously, you've got Shias and Sunnis. And if that weren't enough, you probably also have those who remained in Iraq in opposition to Saddam and those who came in from the outside. But I defer to you. How complex, first of all, is this question of national identity, and how significant is it?
It's extremely significant. It is probably the single most important thing that's obsessing Iraqis at the moment, and hopefully with time, as things settle down, other priorities will come to the fore. But I think you're absolutely correct, and I would like to emphasize complexity. Analysts and pundits, because of lack of time and so on, frequently latch on to the Kurds, the Shia, and the Sunni, the tripartite division. But beneath this are not only multiple identities, but different factors. And I think wisdom begins with deconstructing this, understanding the different components and how they might fit together to present a somewhat different picture.
Phebe, this is obviously, I appreciate that, intricate, complex, as you've just pointed out very, very well. How historic is it? I mean, obviously everything we're talking about must have been, I would suspect, exacerbated by the conflict of today and of recent time. But are there deeper roots historically to this identity?
Oh, yes. They don't spring from the head of Zeus. And of course, Iraq has got one of the oldest histories in history, as we know. But I'm not going to go back to ancient Mesopotamia, of course, because it doesn't go back there. But I would suggest that to understand the modern state, which was founded roughly 1920-21, you can pick your date, you do have to go back to the Ottoman Empire, which governed Iraq for roughly 4 centuries, and particularly, let's say, the century before the founding of the state in the 20th century, because, of course, it was founded on an existing structure. And having done some of that, I see enormous continuities, not only myself, but historically they're there. And if I had to, in terms of state identity, I would say that there are at least 3 or 4 underlying verities there. 3 or 4 ways in which people not only identified themselves, but groups they belong to. One, and the basic one, is tribal, which of course has a relationship to kinship structure, and that's essential almost in any society: kinship, extended family, clan, tribe. Another one is religious identification. First of all, Muslim, and then a Shia Sunni identification, and of course Christians and Jews were in Iraq, and under the Ottoman Empire they had somewhat separate communities, because it was understood they'd have their own religious practices, education, marriage and divorce, inheritance procedures. And a third identity that came in actually with the impact of the West was what we'd call nationalism, identification with a language, ethnic identity. Kurds should have a state, maybe Arabs should have a state. And last but not least is the somewhat tenuous identity with the state itself. Say, under the Ottoman Empire, There were 3 provinces there, but the Ottomans were the state, and they, of course, had a clientele. They had bureaucrats and others who identified on the basis of services and benefits they got. So the idea of identifying with the state authority is not absent. But when the British created the state in 1920, new boundaries encapsulated numerous different groups and created a new state with a capital in Baghdad. And then the question is, how many people and in what way could the citizens of that state identify with the new state and government?
That's a very, very helpful answer, Phoebe. I get the sense of previously existing layered identities, if you will, interwoven perhaps with all these various threads. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I can immediately understand that, for example, right now, when things are under threat, chaos, war, life and death and all of that, you might revert back to the most basic kinds of identities. I mean, it might be a very human thing I think you might want to do. In other words, go back to a tribal identity, because that's bedrock.
That's right. That's absolutely correct. And these are interwoven, and that's exactly what we see. Creating a state, to say nothing of a nation, and the network and the loyalties and some of the ideals and institutions. This is very new, and we see transformation of that in every society in the world. But when you tear that, when you tear away the bureaucracy, the army, the state, then you do fall back on these fundamental identities.
Let me ask you a couple of questions that derive directly from that. On this question of identities and getting frayed by reality and reverting and all of that, and the nature of the state and its constitution, how does the current constitution play into that? I mean, as I understand it, the one that was currently in effect and structured the elections that were held in 2005 probably puts an emphasis more on religion than the previous constitution did. It's less secular, perhaps, than the previous constitution. And a society that's more urban and less rural. I mean, do these things also affect the identity issue?
Yes, I don't want to get into the Constitution because it's not very well structured, in my view. It was put together in a hurry under circumstances I think most people know. There was a lot of pressure to get it done, and if you look at it, it has many conflicting elements. As to the previous Constitution, we have to remember who was in power before. That was Saddam Hussein, and there really wasn't much of a constitution. He was the constitution. They did have a parliament, but the extent to which it actually functioned was, pretty nominal. So I don't want to. There was a constitution under Saddam,
but you don't see it as at all central to this.
No. But what is really central here, I think, is much of this deterioration of the state and loyalty to it and so on took place under Saddam. This is not something that was entirely new with the American occupation, liberation, whatever you want to call it. So there was a really progressive deterioration of state and society, particularly in the last 2 decades of Saddam's rule, with sanctions and so on. And if you go back, you can see these very identities we're looking at: tribalism, division into sectarian communities. Of course, the Kurdish issue reached their epitome under Saddam. But there was still a state there. There was still legal authority. That was torn away, so people fell back on these identities.
There was still a state, but you've emphasized a couple of times now, Phoebe, the progressive deterioration in the bureaucracy and the military and so forth over time. And of course, it's probably a very acute situation right now. Does that suggest, in your mind, Phoebe, that because we use the phrase "failed state," that the state itself could? It's no exaggeration to state this. The Iraqi state could fail even before this question of identity is worked out, because those institutions are so.
Well, I think one of the reasons the state would fail would be the identity issue. It would be it's certainly a contributing force. It is a failing state. At the moment, it's failing, and I think we who analyze it face 3 possible scenarios. It may indeed collapse. We could get some kind of an independent Kurdish entity in the north. It's hard for me to see the Arab portion kind of easily breaking up into Shia and Sunni, but that's a possibility. I don't personally see that as the likely outcome. It could, that it's going to break up into 3 component parts nicely and easily.
Right.
It could break down because there are other component parts, warlords, militias, and so on. Or it can gradually muddle through in a kind of messy way over a considerable period of time. We're talking decade, 2 decades, maybe a generation. But certainly the furniture in the house is going to be rearranged.
Rearranged somehow.
And the problem is that beneath the identities, Kurd, Arab, and Sunni, are also emerging political parties and factions. And I want to emphasize that because leaders are using identity to mobilize support, sharpening these divisions, and trying to find ways to get them off in a different mode.
Well, that would sound like, and I do want to emphasize, get on that point, that that kind of tactic is the method and the goal is to emphasize division, not to form a cohesive identity, is it not? In other words, if we're seeing more schisms and parties forming, reflecting diverse ambitions, it's not in the interest of a cohesive, inclusive national identity, is it?
Well, I won't say that the people involved in this want division. If you ask Iraqi, even many Kurds will say, no, we don't want independence because they realize the cost of that would be too high. And certainly Shia and Sunni will not tell you that they want the state broken up. But this is not a problem unknown elsewhere. Bosnia comes to mind, and many other states. When you have removed the previous leadership, previous institutions, you remove the main military, there's a power struggle here. In fact, you could see that in a peaceful way in the elections. Elections are a power struggle, but they're played out peaceably. Leaders who want to get and maintain power, they want to get rid of the old regime. Old regime is unhappy about being ousted. Some of them want to get back. And in the absence of institutions, liberal institutions, civil society, the Ba'ath Party, the easiest way to do that is to call on your constituents, the Kurds, the Shia, the Sunni, because then you can mobilize votes. And this process leads to what looks like divisions. This is not unknown elsewhere, and it has reached an extreme crisis in Iraq because we've seen the violence played out, particularly in Baghdad, demographic changes, and so on.
That's very helpful, Phoebe. In other words, what you're telling me is, you don't have to look at this as some sort of innate wish for division. It's simply the easiest way to organize and achieve your immediate political goals.
But there's the struggle for power, and I'm a realist in this. I take that as sort of a bedrock. You've got to find ways in which people can overcome that by emphasizing interests, getting individual groups which cross ethnic and sectarian boundaries to agree, I think, on more specific doable things, like how shall we share oil resources? It might be in our interest to protect borders. I mean, there may be ways in which you can find interests which cross this divide over time.
But and again, what it seems to me you're saying, Phoebe, is that the goal you think is the most rational and appropriate one is to mediate out these differences, to find common ground, so to speak, to form an inclusive national identity, and not, and this is the core of my question, because it's so bandied about in our national political life here in America, to move toward the formal separation of these groups, move to an Iraq that is divided up into, several constituent parts, each one having its own identity.
No, I'm not sure that I would say that, because I think at this point that is going to make for a struggle for territory and so on. So I don't really support the partition. The Iraqis themselves have gone a long way, but not a complete way in that direction, and they have more to gain by cooperating than they do by pulling apart. If they don't share oil resources, they're going to have a lot of violence for a long time. And I think this has come to be realized. They have a better economic future if they can find ways in which to share Iraq's resources. And if you talk to most Iraqis, they will tell you they don't want their state split up. So I think there's a certain amount of realism setting in. This is not to say that everybody has the same vision and the same identity, but they can share interests. I would put it this way. We talk about reconciliation here. This is a big word. This is too much to swallow at the moment. I don't know what reconciliation means, but I would pose a 3-level, more achievable goal. coexistence. Get people to coexist peaceably. They're not going to fight over territory and so on. Second, maybe you can get accommodation. This is a much better word, as I've suggested, on much more concrete, doable goals. Oil I mentioned because it's so critical. Once you share those resources, you can, water resources, they share the Tigris and Euphrates. Environment, economic development is something everybody can
So in other words, practical things that can be seen in as being in the common interest, and where there, in some cases, is a history of cooperation to build on.
That's right. And that establishes some trust between the 2 or 3 or 5 people who are sitting around the table. Then you move on elsewhere. Then you get a network of people who maybe they don't like one another, maybe they don't share a total, complete vision, but what they're sharing is benefits from cooperating.
And they gain greater confidence in cooperation as they do that.
That's right. Reconciliation may be the last thing to come. And incidentally, I don't think these communities are nearly as separate as people think. But what we have here is a group of politicians, some of them Kurdish and many of them Shia, who have been out of power and often out of the country as well, who have come into power. And they have spent most of their adult life struggling against Saddam, understandably. The people who are sort of in the Sunni community now, I don't believe anybody wants to see the Ba'ath or Saddam back. But they were in power and now they're out. They had benefits and now they're out. And there's not enough room being made to bring these people back. But one can understand how deep the distrust and suspicion of these two groups are. Overcoming this is going to take time.
But your statement is, to me, both realistic and hopeful. And it seems to me you're building on, I guess, the perhaps trite phrase, confidence-building measures where people begin to cooperate and collaborate and come back together. You were also suggesting in an earlier statement, Phoebe, that Iraqis, even in these dire circumstances, are not that interested in partition, even if certain politicians here may be pushing it as a solution for their problems, that they don't see dividing up the country as a way out.
The question is, how much war weariness is there? How much are people fed up with this? There are some instances in various communities where they want to get out of it, but maybe they need some outside help in mediation and so on. I don't know that we in the United States are the ones to do this.
Well, that was my next question. I mean, what is the proper role for, because we're parties to this identity crisis question, would seem to me, just by the mere fact of being there. So, I mean, what do we do? What's the council? Even if you can't prescribe specific action, what's the status, the profile that America should adopt in face of this?
Well, first of all, we're there. We're part of the problem. We're also part of the solution. It's a very complex business. This is something the Iraqis ultimately have to take the lead on and do. But I'm realistic here too. To say that we don't have any power, we're not there, is ridiculous. I think quietly behind the scenes, and I have every reason to believe that our ambassador and others are doing this. We need to keep pushing and nudging these various political leaders and communities to get together. The main policy now is bottom up. That means you work on local communities, get peace and quiet here, and so on. That will work for a time, and it may quiet some communities, but ultimately Baghdad is the issue.
Okay.
So unless you can get them to come together on some of these key issues, accommodation on some issues, not a grand reconciliation, which I perceive too far for the moment.
Yeah.
We're just going to have to keep the carrot and the stick and pushing, and not expect this to happen overnight.
Which is a great failing, I think, of us sort of
That's right.
by nature.
We have a timetable, incidentally, which we all recognize here. It's called the November election. That's our timetable. It's not necessarily the Iraqis' timetable. So I guess the only word I can say here is it's going to be very messy. It's going to have its ups and downs. But I think my advice to the Americans, we have to get our expectations down to a more realistic level on the timetable. But I pay my taxes to have diplomats do a little pushing and shoving behind the scenes,
right.
In an appropriate way. And left to themselves, the Iraqis may decide to go for a zero-sum game, and so the name. And of course, we ought to be getting as much international. That goes without saying.
Exactly.
Leaning on the neighbors,
but your counsel is marshal the forces of diplomacy, and the resources of patience.
Yes,
that
that's
would
right.
be good counsel.
And economics. The more you can get people off the political track. The zero-sum game, and get economic development. So there's another vision, another alternative, all across the board. That's
right.
That's obvious. Not so easy to do while there's instability.
Let me ask you this, Phoebe. A few moments ago, you used a phrase that really captivated my imagination. You said Baghdad is where the stakes are, or something to that effect, which is certainly true in many respects. Obviously, that's the capital. That's where things are decided, the center of power. But it also strikes me that, and you, at the outset of our conversation, helped me, and I think everyone watching, a lot to understand the ancientness of so much of what we're talking about here. And in that ancientness, Baghdad is an extremely important player culturally and as a center of cohesion. How important is that now? I mean, the fact that from my thousands away, miles away vantage point, Baghdad is a very troubled city. How central is a safe Baghdad, a restored Baghdad, to everything we're talking about?
It's extremely central. There are divergent views on this, and incidentally, it's very controversial. Many people say, well, if you can get some stability in Kurdistan, or you could get calm down the Sunni area, the Shia area, but the territory between the two rivers has never flourished without some central control. We could go way back in history and show how there was decline through many of these empires when there wasn't control, particularly over the river system. Now oil is more central to this. But let me make a couple of points. Baghdad, in recent history and certainly recent years, is at least 25, maybe up to 30% of the population.
Is that right?
Yes. We are not talking about a small. Well, I'm talking about Greater Baghdad, the Baghdad province. But that's essentially.
That's huge. A third of the country.
Yes, that's correct. Or at least 25. Let's not push it too high. 25% of the country, and we all know too much power was centralized there. But the middle class, which was an educated middle class, which was mainly secular, professional, and like all middle classes, identified more with not only economic status and their professions, were not very interested in ethnic and sectarian identity, was certainly not interested in tribal identity. Right. And this middle class, that's what's happened here. Under Saddam and earlier as well, it's not just under the occupation, but recently, Baghdad has been torn apart. And this trained middle class has virtually disappeared. We have huge numbers of refugees now in Jordan, in Syria, and elsewhere. You can't build a country, and you can't help build this identity back without the middle class, which was centered in Baghdad. Baghdad is not completely gone, incidentally. There are still many mixed areas, but the destruction in Baghdad has been central to this whole process.
So the reconstruction of Baghdad is equally central to the resolution of this problem.
It's not the only thing.
It's not the only thing, but making it a magnet again to get that middle class back into the country and functioning again is extremely important. Phoebe, we've had a time just to delve into some of the more important of the many headline issues that are concerned with this question, but the obvious one that comes to my mind right now as we come close to the end of our conversation is this. How do Iraqis advance this necessary conversation about identity? I mean, you yourself have been, in recent days even, at meetings at which a great number of Iraqi participants have perhaps been talking about this. I mean, what is there, we know what the message is. The message is get together. Now, what is there necessarily a method, or are there many methods, or how does this happen?
First of all, we're not sure it's going to happen. It's still it's still very, very tenuous. But at many levels, I'm a great believer in track 1, 1.5, track two, I should say, track 1.5 diplomacy, where distrust and misunderstanding and isolation often is so great. Even getting people together to learn to argue properly is very important. But as I've suggested, let's go back to political leaders, because political leaders are going to have to come to the point where they feel they have more to lose by not cooperating, by not making a deal, than by making it. And when they get it war weary enough, they're finally going to do this. But it'll probably be done with small steps and on specific issues. Mm-hmm. There are many people who would like to lock them in a room, as we did with the Afghans in Bonn, and say, come up with the Grand Compact. I wouldn't be opposed to that if it could be done, but my suspicion is that that's going to be very hard to, or they might come up with something on the piece of paper and go home and fight again. But I think slowly, maybe not surely, but slowly on specific issues where they find they just can't win. Mm-hmm. The zero-sum game doesn't work. I probably can get more by making some kind of a deal, and Arabs in general, Middle Easterners in general, are very good at deal making. They love to negotiate. And ultimately, I think if the Iraqis come together slowly, and we can see a little of this process, not enough, and that's why we still have the violence, step by step on specific issues across these lines, and a network will grow. And it will be so imperceptible that we will hardly notice it until... It
sounds to me like a need to reemphasize the language of negotiation, which is actually part of the culture. And to use Jesse Jackson's immortal phrase, where they disagree without being disagreeable. and to find common ground, and these are the things that will make it work. Phebe, when this all hopefully does happen, and I join you because I think this is a very rational approach to it, well, maybe we'll save this question for our next conversation, but I'm very interested in what the role Iraq might play in terms of the Middle East, this new Iraqi identity. Would it be, because at one point it was so consumed with Arab nationalism, might it be a very different kind of thing?
Oh, it's going to be a very different Iraq. I think these sub-identities have to be recognized. There'll be a weak central government for a long time to come. You have to prepare yourself to allow Iraq to work this through for at least a couple of decades. So I don't see Iraq playing a huge regional role yet. Just let it come to its own conclusions.
Phebe, thank you so much. You're a wonderful guide. I'll put it that way.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
My pleasure.
Good.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at Dialogue at wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Phebe Marr, thank you. You did beautifully.
Thank you. Was that okay?